Hello and welcome to this week's hard-working edition of Theology Thursday. I'm Pastor Chris Laughlin, Messiah Lutheran Church in Constantine, joined as ever by my faithful and steadfast colleague, Pastor James Smith, who is the pastor of St. John Lutheran Church in Three Rivers and the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church, also Three Rivers. How are you today, Pastor James?
Well, I am good. I am ready to treat this good working and hard working work by Luther here. And we've got Titus, who's very excited to see Uncle Chris and to rip into this theology here.
So we have discussed the three sort of well-published, well-known treatises of Martin Luther from 1520, the Address to the Christian Nobility, the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, and the Freedom of a Christian. Today we talk about a lesser known, lesser discussed treatise called the Treatise on Good Works. And Pastor James, I have to ask you, I mean, Luther is very clear that we are saved by grace alone, by faith alone, through Christ alone, which we hear about in the Word alone. So what else is there but to sit back and put my feet up by a nice warm place and eat my cookies and watch my Star Trek?
Well, you are not the first person to ask that, maybe with those exact examples, but actually, as of 1520, before even the big treatises that we've talked about comes out, Luther is getting those questions. And at some point during this treatise, he talks about there are basically four groups of people. And the second group is the group that falls into, who are the smug folks who basically want to say, I'm saved by faith, so I don't have to do anything. But turns out that doesn't work, does it?
Well, no, and this is something that biblical authors, the authors of the New Testament faced as well. Should we go on sinning that grace may abound? By no means. It's all variations, I think, on a theme. That was from Paul, I think, Romans 6.
Yep.
It might have been Romans 7.
It's Romans 6.
Yeah, it was Romans 6. Good. I knew it was Romans. Anyway, you know, I think you see the author of James, the book of James, the Epistle of James, struggling with this. And in different ways, the authors of the Johannine epistles are struggling with this as well. But the question comes to Luther, and I think sometimes it's probably a sincere question, and other times it's more of an attack.
Yeah.
You know, you say we're saved by grace, like, you know, by faith in Christ alone. Why, what's the Christian walk all about then, Luther? And there will be those who are confused and angered. I'm reading from the introduction to the annotated Luther's edition of this. And I think there will be some who are legitimately wondering.
Yeah, and actually that debate about that difference between legitimate and attack is kind of the history of the publication of this too, which is he promised a congregation of lay people that was sincerely interested. He said, "I'll preach a sermon on good works sometime," and then he got attacked, and they were like, "Luther, you need to respond." And he's like, "No, I don't want to give them credence by I don't want to dignify this with a response." But then he was reminded that he promised the congregation the sermon. So, oh, buddy. So he put together this that quickly transmogrified into something. I mean, if this is over 100 pages, so if you or I preach this sermon, you know, the last one in any congregation. So it became a little book instead, or a treatise. I think one thing to remember is just because you're saved by faith apart from works, just because your works don't save you doesn't mean you don't need to do them, Titus, does it? I mean, to do that, you really do have to throw out like the entire Sermon on the Mount, for instance. If you really believe it, you have to throw out the 10 Commandments. And both of these Luther preaches on, and against all the stereotypes you've ever heard, he actually says you do have to do them. You know, I think faith is not an abstract thing, but it's faith in this person, Jesus, who is God, who taught us some very concrete things that we should be doing in our lives. So faith is living for him, and I think that means taking a close look at how he taught us to live.
And those works, those things that God commands us to do not save us, but they are still good because God commanded us to do them.
Yeah.
And in that, Luther redefines good works against what was being taught at the time by the church. So the church taught that good works were things that worked toward your salvation, and they included fasting and praying and pilgrimages and indulgences or other forms of giving money. And Luther says, no, those are not good works. Those are things prescribed by human beings, added to God's law, which are basically meaningless. You want good works? Look no further than the Ten Commandments.
Right, and that's the outline of this treaty. He has a really interesting psychological point here that I wanted to bring up. So we talked in the Freedom of a Christian how the big analogy is the bride and the bridegroom. The bridegroom is Christ, who gives everything he has to the bridegroom, who does not have the most sterling reputation, or to the bride, who does not have the most sterling reputation in town. And so he actually returns to the marriage metaphor here, or I guess he pre-turns since this one came out first. And he talks about when you have a marriage and the relationship is on the rocks a bit, you're always looking for a way to win back or impress your significant other. Think of the big jewelry or the big bouquet of flowers, the I'm sorry bye sort of thing. Where you're really trying to make an impression because you're thinking, what can I do? What can I do to get this person back on my good side here? And he says that on the other hand, when a relationship's going well, you kind of just intuitively know what to do. You're always wanting to do things that actually need to get done, like the dishes or making the bed or saying kind words to the person, and it's not out of this calculating, scheming, calculus. It's just these loving works flow naturally. And he says, well, it's kind of like that with God too. And I think in his time period, especially, it was because in medieval Catholicism, there was a very strong fear of the Last Judgment. Today we've almost gone too far the other way. We hardly talk about the Last Judgment at all. But Christ was not seen as a savior so much as a terrifying judge by many people. And so it was like, well, what can I do to get on Christ's good side? And instead of just doing the things that we're told naturally to do in the Ten Commandments that people take for granted, loving your father or mother, keeping the Sabbath, not stealing, giving to those in need. They're coming up with these things you talked about, like the fasting or the you'll like this one, Chris, because you have to get your hair cut for the army, but the monastic tonsure, where you got the giant bald spot in the middle, and and he's making the point, I think, that this is coming not out of faith, but really out of fear and kind of almost a frantic nature of trying to please God when to quote Micah, he has told you, O mortal, what is good. Like Jesus, Moses, they all spend a lot of time saying, here are the things that are pleasing to God. And, the Ten Commandments where he starts is probably the best example.
And I love the way, and I think it's important that you bring up that example of the husband and wife. Luther writes, we may illustrate this with a common, down-to-earth example. And then he goes on to explain, when a husband or wife cherishes and pleases the other spouse and truly believes it, who needs to teach them how to act or what to do, when to speak or not, or what to think about the other? Their own competence alone teaches all that and more. There is no difference in the works they do, be they great or small, extended or brief, many or few. And I think that's important because, whereas when we read Babylonian Captivity at the church, that's clearly written for other theologians, educated folks. Luther's writing this for anyone who can read, or even anyone who can listen to what's being read to them. This is written for everyone.
Right.
You know, I have accused Luther in the past of being elitist, and there are times when I think he is, but I think this is one of those times when he is not.
Right. And I want to say real quick, and then we might need a break to see if I can get him set up with some toys or something. But to that end, I think we don't want to leave unremarked upon that he's really sanctifying daily life quite a bit. You know, the Christian ball game is not what happens just when you're at church or on a pilgrimage. It's every moment of your life. For instance, you know, if you're parenting, or maybe if you or if you're a child and you think about that commandment, honor your father or mother. But yeah, so you don't, you know, Christianity is not something removed from everyday life. It is everyday life.
You can drive like a Christian.
Yeah, and you can drive like someone who's not.
A pagan, a heathen, a Turk, I just read Luther say something to that effect, yes. Shall we give it a pause, Pastor James?
Yes, I think so. Thank you. Yeah, and so we've deposited one of our friends here in his pack and play for a little bit. By the way, if you're wondering what that word tonsure is, now that you can see my shirt, you can see right here, the guy has the hair on the outer rim. There you go. That's what that's called, tonsure. That's your vocab word for today. But we're not here to talk about tonsures. We're here to talk about good works. And do we want to start with what's the first commandment?
Yeah, I mean, Luther says if you want to do good works, look no further than the 10 Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And then Luther just moves into the 10 Commandments. And as you and I were talking in the pregame, Pastor James, what surprised me the most, this is 8 or 9 years before the small and large catechisms, before Luther writes the small and large catechisms. And his theology of the 10 Commandments is pretty well developed already and doesn't change much. He's pretty consistent. Right. So yeah, I mean, it should be known, first of all, that no good work exists other than those that God has commanded, just as there is no sin other than what God has forbidden. The foremost and noblest of good work is faith in Christ, just as he himself said in John 6. And side note, when you're reading Luther, verses haven't been invented yet. Mm-hmm. So Luther will just say, as in John 6, our modern editions often include brackets with the verse numbers, but Luther didn't know those. When the Jews asked him what they should do in order to perform the good works of God, he answered, "This is the good work of God, that you believe in him in whom he has sent."
Yeah, which is interesting because we're so used to thinking of faith versus works, and you know, there's a reason for that, because faith is a gift, as Luther says many times, but also, you know, using this gift that we've been given of faith, that is a work, like because, and I think it changes how we think about faith too. Faith is something that has to be taken out for a drive, right? And that's and the drive is daily life, as seen through these 10 Commandments here. Yeah.
If you then ask people the following: when they are on the job, walking or standing still, eating, drinking, sleeping, or engaging in any activity that sustains the body or promotes the common good, do they consider their actions to be good works pleasing to God? You will find they say no. They define good works very narrowly and confine them to church-related activities like praying, fasting, and giving alms. Yeah. And Luther will go out of his way to say that praying, fasting, and giving alms are good things to do. You should do them. But that's not where good works stop. Right. Pilgrimages and tonsures and things like that, it doesn't have much use for the stuff that was not in Scripture and was, as far as he was concerned, was added later by the church. But when they were on the job, walking or standing still, eating, drinking, sleeping, or engaging in any activity that sustains the body or promotes the common good, these are good works pleasing to God. And they are works which can be done well, or in faith, or in service to the neighbor, and therefore are pleasing to God. Yeah, and a big part of it is that disposition of, you said, are they done in faith? Because, you know, you can't,
Yeah, it's like seeing your job or your vocation is a word that obviously he loves, which means calling, or your relationships as your Christian responsibility. So you know, I've asked people before, um, tell me about your vocation, your Christian vocation. Um, and I sometimes have to pry very hard to convince people how being good at their job serves any sort of a Christian role. You know, you get blank stares when you start to talk about that. So they'd rather talk about, well, I served on church council a few years ago, or I went on a mission trip a few years back, you know, or I went to Synod Assembly, and it's like all of those things are fine. Um, but you know, there's such a comparatively small part of the pie of our everyday life versus, you know, are you faithfully doing your job? Is your job one that improves the quality of people's lives? And it may be that job allows me to feed my family, in which case that is, you know, improving the quality of people's lives. But you know, it may also be that this is even a restaurant like is feeding people, is providing a role in the community, and to really think about your everyday life through a Christian lens, I think is part of what he's getting at.
And then Luther goes on, do you see, this is the work of the first commandment, you shall have no other gods. And then he goes on to define the first commandment in the same way that he defines it in the large catechism. That is to say, since I alone am God, all your confidence, trust, and faith should be placed only in me and no one else. You do not have a God when all you do is mouth the word or worship by bowing the knee or making external gestures instead of trusting God from the heart and counting on God's goodness, grace, and favor in all that you do or suffer. In living and dying in weal and woe, just as Christ said to the Samaritan woman in John 4, I say to you, whoever worships God must worship in spirit and truth.
Mm-hmm.
He will come back to this repeatedly throughout the rest of his treatise on good works, in the same way that he explains the 10 commandments after he goes through them in the large catechism. All of the commandments then point back to the first commandment.
And for more on the 10 Commandments, watch our 39-part series on the 10 Commandments filmed last summer. Do we have anything else to say on the first commandment? Because I think it's, as in the 10 Commandments, you know, that they repeat the first commandment. It always comes up, you know, that doing things with faith is the most important thing, with trust in God.
And then Luther sort of addresses his critics in a sideways sort of way here. When some people say that good works are forbidden when we preach faith alone, it is similar to this. Suppose I advise a sick person, if you are healthy, your body could perform all its functions, but without your health, everything you do is nothing. And someone, upon hearing this, concluded that I had forbidden the sick man's body to perform any of its functions, even though what I meant was that health had to be there first, which could then stimulate the actions of all the bodily members. Likewise, in all works, faith must be the master artisan and the captain, for they amount to nothing at all.
It's funny you brought that up because we didn't discuss it in our pregame, but that was one of my favorite quotes I meant to bring up. Yeah, it's like in mine it said limbs. So if your limbs are moving, but it's rigor mortis, you know, that's not going to do you any good. And I think that's what Luther would accuse a lot of these works of, you know, fasting or indulgences or whatever. It's basically, instead of doing the hard work of healthy Christian trusting relationship in God, I'm doing enough to get by, as far as I understand it, and that's not really the point for him.
Not at all.
And I really love this is kind of the last thing I have to say on this particular treatise for now, at least. But I love when he gets into the second commandment, which is about not misusing the Lord's name. He says, it's always the case that the high and better the works are, the less show they make. It's evident that everyone thinks that such works are easy to do, because no one imagines he praises God's name and honor so much is the very men, and they often were men back then, who never do it. In other words, all the people in the monasteries are going on the pilgrimages back then. Let's see. These men make such a show of doing it, yet their heart is without faith and causes this precious work to be despised. So that the Apostle Paul dared say boldly in Romans 2 that those who make their boast in the law of God blaspheme his name the most. 4. It is an easy matter to name the name of God and to write his honor on paper or on a wall or on a Facebook post or on a bracelet or on a bumper sticker or on a billboard. But genuinely to praise and bless him in his good deeds and confidently to call upon him in all adversities is, next to faith, truly the rarest and highest of works. So that if we were to see how little of this there is in Christendom, we might despair for the very sorrow of it. Yet in the meantime, there's a constant increase of high, handsome, and glorious works, which men have thought up, or of works which seem to look like those true works, but at bottom are all utterly without faith and trust, and in short have nothing good behind them.
And just in case you, our beloved watchers and listeners, our followers, happen to be reading, that's from Luther's works, which was translated, I believe, in the 60s. If you're reading the annotated Luther, translated just a few years ago, the translation is vastly different. Sometimes it's just a word here or there. It's not in this one. But they're saying the same thing. They really are. Like, I've been following along.
Yeah.
Woo.
No, but I think it's I think whatever the translation, it's clear that so often we still do the same thing. We glorify the person who's very outspoken or public, and the person who just quietly loves God and loves their neighbor rarely gets the attention, and that's. I think it's very unfortunate because on the one hand, we can't assume people are just going to take Christianity for granted these days with how it's an ever shrinking portion of the population. So we do need to talk about it. But I think there's just always so much of the time we do things that draw attention to ourselves, and we end up not recognizing the quiet everyday works. I think it's still a major problem.
It was a problem in Jesus' day too, right? Do not be like the hypocrites, for they like to stand on the street corners. Yeah.
Right.
Do not therefore despair and throw up your hands if you discover that in prayer or other works you do not believe as strongly as you should and would like to believe. Instead, you should give thanks to God from the bottom of your heart that he has revealed your weakness to you and thereby teaches and admonishes you how necessary it is for you to practice your faith and strengthen it daily.
Yeah, that's a highlight that runs through a lot of this. Is just it's okay to trust in God. In fact, it's very good to trust in God and that God will save me. But kind of smug self-satisfaction is not the point of the Christian life. Like I once heard a person saying, we were doing the small catechism of the Ten Commandments as an adult class, and they were like, doesn't really include all of that, or like quibbling about one particular thing that was asked. And I said, honestly, you're never going to be able to keep any of these anyway. And like, if you're going through this and thinking, okay, I can do this, I can do that, and I'm good to go, then you've missed the point, because a big part of good works is just turning us back to Christ and turning us back to forgiveness over and over again. And that's I think where kind of the rubber does meet the road here is, can you possibly do enough good works to be right with God? Roman Catholics would not take faith out of that picture at all, don't get me wrong, but they would say ultimately, especially in Luther's time, if you have faith that results in these good works, you can at least eat away at your time at purgatory to a negligible extent. And for Luther, even as he re-identifies good works you can do, you're never going to run out of reasons to ask for and need forgiveness.
Here it is also, we're several commandments later now, but here it is also important to realize that the same generosity, and I think it's interesting when Luther approaches the 10 Commandments here, it's not just thou shalt not, but he almost starts and leads with thou shalt. So the opposite of theft is generosity.
Right.
Here it is also important to realize that the same generosity must be extended to enemies and opponents. Here it becomes clear how difficult it is to do good works according to God's commandment, and how human nature resists, squirms, and stalls because it much prefers its own easier, self-chosen works.
Yeah.
Stick with the 10 Commandments, folks. They're hard enough.
Yeah. I think at one point he says it would take you not only a lifetime just to do the first commandment, but the lifetimes of like thousands of people. In order
yeah,
to
that's in there.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the big point of this. If you need to come up with extraneous works, that like you haven't done a good enough job on these ones here yet. It's kind of like when I was a kid, I would do a really shabby job of cleaning my room, and then so I might be on to doing another thing around the house that I was asked to do, and it's like, man, you must be really great. You're moving so fast compared to this other sibling. And it's like, no, they're just actually taking the time to get the cleaning of the room right, and the room is the 10 Commandments, and setting the table is the tonsure. Like, yeah, it might be nice, but what I really asked you to do was clean your room.
I think we basically covered it, Pastor James.
Yeah, I'm glad that we came back and hit the spot that we missed in 1520 with this one. So I'm excited to see where the rest of our adventures through Luther's works will take us.
And we look forward to you seeing and hearing us, oh listeners, oh watchers, whenever it is that we return.
Yes, and if you like these videos or if you like the caps, please subscribe and share with a friend.